Namaskar everyone, my name is Rehan and I'm a sophomore at the George Washington University studying International Affairs and Finance. Today I'll be talking about Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and its impact on the development of Kashmiri Pundits both home and abroad. It's been approximately 1 year since the revocation of Article 370, a constitutional provision that dates all the way back to 1954. Let's go back about 60 years and first outline the historical background of Article 370 and its associated provisions. Kashmir, which was a princely state at the time and was a Muslim plurality, was stuck between ascending either to Pakistan or India. To coax the representatives from the princely state, the government acquiesced to demands that the extension of powers of the Indian Constitution could only apply to Jammu and Kashmir given the agreement of the State Assembly. Essentially, the article states that Kashmir, upon accession to India, gains special status as an Indian state, and that it will continue to maintain autonomy in the matters of citizenship, ownership of property, and fundamental rights, among others. A big caveat in the application of Article 370 is that it was meant to be a temporary measure and would be deemed necessary or otherwise by a legislative body until the state developed their own constitution. However, on January 25th, 1957, the aforementioned body dissolved without giving a recommendation, and as such, Article 370 and its associated provisions were deemed to be a permanent part of the Indian Constitution. The application of Article 370 was used by the state of Jammu and Kashmir to legislate matters that the state felt was best left to them, and some examples include, but certainly are not limited to, matters of marriage and divorce, infants and minors, transfer of property other than agricultural land, contracts, torts, bankruptcy settlements, trusts, courts, family planning, and charities. In fact, the only matters that were under the jurisdiction of the Indian government included matters of national defense, interstate transport systems, as well as federal banking regulations and taxes, among others. Given that the State Assembly was now more or less the sole arbitrator of legislative matters in Kashmir, there are many policies in place that contributed to the development of prejudice against certain population, and a big aspect of this was women's rights. In 2004, the J&K Assembly passed a bill known as the Daughters Bill. The new law sought to deprive daughters of the state's permanent residents of all their native-born rights and privileges if they were to marry someone who was not the subject of Jammu or Kashmir. Another double standard was that the law only applied to the female citizens of Kashmir and not the men. Unfortunately, because of Article 370 and associated provisions, the federal government had no say in the matter. Another example was the matter of jobs and employment when it came to citizenship. Under the state laws, the Jammu and Kashmir High Court was able to prohibit the appointment of Dr. Shashila Sawehi in 1979 to her post of assistant professor in Government Medical College. Dr. Sawehi was, in fact, a Kashmir-born woman, but because she was married to a man outside of Kashmir, the government was able to prohibit her appointment to Government Medical College. Jill Cottrell in 2013 wrote a paper titled Kashmir, the Vanishing Autonomy, in which she explicitly states that the autonomy and special status, Article 370, granted to the state of Jammu and Kashmir made it possible for it to have rather lower standards of human rights. Unfortunately, when speaking about Article 370, one big aspect that has to be mentioned is the rise of rampant terrorism, both state-sponsored and fundamental, in the valley. Rahul Pandita said it best when he titled his book, Our Moon Has Blood Clots. The Kashmiri Pandit community is no stranger to vile acts of terrorism that have been rampant for decades. Over 500,000 members of our community were forcibly displaced upon threat of death, rape, or torture, while thousands lost their life to senseless violence. This level of ethnic cleansing gets little attention from the media due to the controversy surrounding Kashmir in the present day, but what many don't realize is that it was Article 370 that made it possible for terrorists to run rampant in the valley to the extent that they did. External Affairs Minister S. J. Shankar writes in the Foreign Review, quote, the resulting separatist sentiments in some quarters were then often exploited by neighboring Pakistan to conduct cross-border terrorism, end quote. Now, this separatist sentiment is a direct byproduct of the implementation of Article 370, which makes it seem as though Kashmir isn't actually part of India due to the full autonomy that it received under those articles. The development of tension in the valley was a direct byproduct of religion. Kashmir was and is to this day the only Muslim majority state in India. And as a result, the territorial claim to Kashmir by Pakistan can be analogous to the territorial claim over Crimea from Russia, and in the eyes of the international community, it should be just as illegal. As I outlined previously, it was Article 370, in my opinion, that gave way for terrorism to flourish to the extent that it did. It is my belief that Article 370 not been in effect, the level of terrorism in the region would not have been as high as it was, and the government would not have needed permission from the local state assembly for regional protection, which was the clause that they used in order to not let Indian Army border forces secure the region. Foreign governments instigated the conflict by funding and abetting terrorists and sharing their data for easy access into Jammu and Kashmir. Since the ascension of Kashmir to India, nearby powers have done everything they can to destabilize the region. Whether it be Pakistan or China, they have been highly publicized efforts to delegitimize the government's legal authority over the region. Highlighted here are just a few examples of terror attacks by fundamentalists. From Amarnath to Pulwama, terrorism has run rampant in Kashmir, and the citizens have suffered as a result. Within Kashmir, there are a plethora of locations that are conducive to terrorism due to their geopolitical significance and their location and proximity. Training camps are common in these areas for groups such as Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. Both terrorist groups have contributed to a destabilization of the valley in the last couple of decades. However, empirical data shows that leading up to and after the revocation of Article 370, the amount of deaths at the hand of militants was significantly reduced, thus reaffirming my belief that the institutionalization of Indian security forces would have helped combat insurgent forces in the region. However, as I'll continue to show, the state of Kashmir, as it was in my opinion, would not have been hospitable to the Hindus. The demographics of Kashmir were the first obstacles in the path to a hospitable home for Kashmiri Pandits. In 1961, with a population of 24.32 lakhs, constituted 68.31% of the state's population of 35.6 lakhs, while Hindus, numbering about 10.13 lakhs, made up about 28.45%. The recent statistics show that are provided highlight that the Pandit population is now a fraction of what it once was. The reason these statistics are so important is to highlight the minority struggle that Pandits have gone through and continue to go through in the valley. Even without Article 370, Pandits were still a minority, and even without 370, Pakistan was sending terrorists to destabilize the region. In the midst of seeing so many of their brothers and sisters violently murdered in the name of fundamental religion, the most logical outcome, unfortunately, would have probably been for them to leave Kashmir for the time being. Even by region, what is so painfully evident is that Kashmiri Pandits were hopelessly outnumbered. The only area in all of Jammu and Kashmir where Hindus were a majority was southern Jammu, and Jammu as a whole when accounting for extraneous population. Combined with the Kashmiri Muslims community's indifference to the plight of their neighbors, these two facts contributed to a hostile environment for Kashmiri Pandits, and one that sooner rather than later would have most likely contributed to Kashmiri Pandits leaving Kashmir, definitely to a much lesser extent, however. In the era of social media activism, it has now become cool or woke to post about issues plaguing the world today, especially if you know nothing about the historical context of the situation. It's become acceptable to know absolutely nothing about a topic and yet continue to ramble on as if you've studied this topic extensively. The rise of misinformation doesn't do our community any good and causes people who have the platforms to spread awareness to post incorrect information. One such example of this is the organization known as Stand With Kashmir, a social media-based organization dedicated to, as they call it, quote, decolonize Kashmir. Since the revocation of Article 370, their following has become larger, and they have started to post more inaccurate information about the situation at hand. I've seen a plethora of their posts on people's profiles who aren't as informed about the situation, but post because it seems like it's from a legitimate source, which Stand With Kashmir is not. At the time of this video, they have about 43,000 followers on Instagram and 27,000 on Twitter. Their posts highlight the, quote, inexcusable actions of the Indian government and the need for self-determination, unquote. However, these posts are often missing a disclaimer. The people that the Indian government and army is after are terrorists, and as you can see here, it's often failed to be mentioned. And to add to the pile, they have never once talked about the plight of Kashmiri Hindus and flat out refused to acknowledge the 7 funded exoduses. By pushing our story deeper and deeper into the ground, their hope is that the people who aren't as informed about the situation continue to spread a false narrative. It's organizations such as the KOA, with initiatives such as this video competition, that really continue to tell the true story about Kashmir and hopefully educate people who may not be as informed. It is impossible to predict the future. As great as that would be, all we can really do is rely on the past to help us guess what is to come. And to be honest, I'm pretty hopeful. For 30 years, older members of our community have had to live in pain, recounting what they went through all those years ago. They've had to uproot their entire lives in a matter of minutes and venture to parts unknown. For those who took it a step further and decided to move halfway across the globe, they've had to start lives from scratch, raise families in a new and unfamiliar place, hoping one day that they'll be able to go home to Srinagar, to Ranawari, to wherever they were from, and experience their old lives with their families. The revocation of Article 370 is an action that has already and will continue to change the future for Kashmiri pundits everywhere for the better.